Now let's talk about the next technique that I have been calling mind mapping, which is based on a book which is mentioned below. The mind is a very complex organism or a complex set of processes. So many things happen in the mind. It has to think of what is in front of us, then it has to reflect, organize on what things happened in the past. Also, it has to think about the possible things that can happen in the future. This is only when we think in terms of a timeline. Then there are real life events associated with our thinking. At other times, there are emotions that cause some feelings in us and bring out new thoughts. On top of that, old thoughts create new thoughts. Now add new thoughts that the subconscious mind creates on a continuous basis to solve problems it thinks the person is facing. In this way, you have thoughts creating thoughts creating thoughts. And then you add the problem of intensity. If you add emotion to a thought, then it becomes heavier. That heaviness makes the thought seems bigger. That bigness makes the thought seem infinite. Then multiply this bubbles rising of thoughts into a dozen. In no time, the mind begins to feel the pain of all those thought bubbles. Actually, calling them bubble is a misnomer. We should call them balls of metal that cling to our legs of the mind, preventing us from moving freely. Then all those balls of metal are swiveling around our minds, creating havoc. As you have already imagined based on my description, it's the equivalent of hell on earth. Sadly, what I have just described is what many people have got to live on a day to day basis. I would like you to take a look at the picture on your left for those of you who are looking at the video book, and the picture below for those of you who are reading the book. You can see the boy who is engaged in traditional thinking. His head is spinning with the heaviness of those seemingly infinite number of thoughts that are like balls of metal rotating in his mind without any particular trajectories, each banging on one and the other. This boy is frustrated and is severely impaired by his own thoughts. On his side is a boy who is engaged in overthinking, but in the modern way, using mind mapping. As you can see the expression on the boy's face, he is much more relieved and stress free. This is mainly because he is not disturbed by the balls of metals which he has converted into bubbles of water. You too can do it if you follow the instruction in these sections. Now let me describe to you the diagram which constitutes the mind map on the far right side. You have to begin with the thought zero, which here is described or presented as the red bubble. First, from this red zero bubble comes out the first layer of thoughts, like thought number one. Then from thought number one, another layer of thought emerges, which we have indicated as 1.1, 1.2, and 1.3. And then from 1.2, the third layer emerges, which we have indicated as 1.2.1. Similarly, still in layer 1, ranging from thought 0, other thoughts come out like thought number 2, 3, 4, and 5. Absent in the other thoughts, in thought number 2, there's a second layer that emerges, which is indicated as 2.1. So let me describe to you the mechanics of how the mind maps work without any particular example at this point, because I first need you to understand the process of mind mapping. In order to understand what I'm going to say, you have to take a look at the arrows. For those of you who are watching the video book, you can see the arrows that I'm talking about with the movement of the mouse that I'll be doing. For those who are reading the book, you'll have to use your own imagination based on the arrows that indicate the direction and the movement that I'm talking about. So let's begin. So this boy starts from the thought 0, and then his thought 0 leads to another thought number 1. Then from thought number 1, it leads to thought number 1.2, and then he moves to thought number 1.2.1, and then he comes back to the thought 0. Then from the thought 0, he moves again to the thought number 1.1, and then he goes to thought number 1 again, which takes him to thought number 1.3. Then he goes back to thought 0. From thought 0, he goes to thought 2, then he goes to 2.1, and then he comes back to thought 0. You realize that from thought 0, he takes a short detour to thought number 3 and comes back again. The same happens with thought number 4, and the final thought that he dwells into is thought number 5, and then it comes back to thought 0. This is how the boy using mind mapping is overthinking. It is extremely powerful because this boy actually knows how his thoughts are moving in his mind. The beauty of mind mapping is that you can visualize and interpret the thoughts that are playing in your mind. What I have just described to you might seem a bit abstract, but it will be very clear once I provide to you an example. What is happening in the traditional boy is that thoughts are moving in him, but he's not able to connect the various thoughts to an original thought and classify those thoughts so that they are subheadings of the main thoughts. This creates a total disorganized thinking process. This is why people hate overthinking, even though they cannot help overthinking. But with the method of mind mapping, you can overthink as much as you want and not feel pain or suffer any discomfort in your mind, body, and emotions. Now let's move on to an example to illustrate the mind mapping process that I have just described to you. Let's take an example of a student. Let the thought 0 be that he needs to study. Again, for those who are watching the video book, you can look at the arrows moving as I'll be talking using the mouse. So this boy thinks of studying, and then he thinks of math, which is thought number one. After thinking about that particular subject, he thinks of a particular chapter in that subject that he is quite confused, which would be 1.1. Then he comes back to the original thought that I need to study. This boy diverts his mind to a friend who has had a conflict with him in the classroom, which would be thought number two. He recalled that it was a quite big alteration in the class, but it's over now, and both apologized to one another. Remember, this boy is using her mind map while he is studying and thinking at the same time. So he's aware that he's deviating his mind away from thought number one, which was about the subject that he wanted to study, which was math. So now what he does, from the thought about the alteration that he had with his friend, he goes back to thought zero and recalls that he has to study. So he goes back to his original subject that he was studying, which is math, which is indicated by thought number one here. Then he recalls a particular problem in the math textbook that he was studying, which would be 1.2. Then he forces himself to find a solution, which would be 1.2.1. Now he has found the solution. So he is drawn back to the thought zero, I need to study. And he realizes that his mind is again diverting to another thought, number three, which says that he's hungry and he would like to have a snack time. However, because he is using the mind map, he is able to snap out of this thought and come back to the original thought zero. Then his mind again takes a detour to thinking about what will happen to his career, which is thought number four. Again, because he knows that he is deviating from the original purpose, which was to extend on the thought number one, he is able to come back from thought number four, and then his mobile rings and he thinks about the text message that he just got from one of his friends, which is indicated here by thought number five. However, he recalls that he is still using the mind map, and it is going to take away his time from studying. So he comes back to thought zero. Now, remember that all this is possible, that a small boy like that can manage his mind because he is using the mind mapping tool. Now, having control his mind using this process, he is now at thought zero, knowing that the thought of the conflict with his friends, the thought of having to eat, the prospect of a career, and even the text message from his friends are still looming in his mind, but unable to affect him because he knows that he is in control. So now he remembers that he has to go to the math studies and finish the last part that he had intended to do, which was to understand a particular chapter in the math subject, which is indicated here by 1.3. Finally, having completed that particular chapter revision, he comes back to thought zero, I need to study. Basically, the boy is happy and he has achieved his goal, yet all those thoughts came and went without affecting him, and they were all entertained, but without burdening him. In this way, you have learned how overthinking works. Imagine that you do not have the mind map advantage in the process of thinking that I just described. How could you possibly manage all this? It would be like an air controller trying to manage all the planes in the air without the air control system mainly consisting of radars and dots on the screen indicating the plane's movement. There definitely is going to be bound to be accidents. What I am amazed at is that people think that they can overthink without using a mind map. Yeah, you could climb a steep mountain without any protective gear, but most likely you'd fall and die. Similarly, you can be a real thinker and you can be really good at thinking, but without mind mapping, you will hurt yourself. You might argue that the great thinkers, philosophers who make a living out of thinking are not using mind mapping. My counter question to you is that how do you know that they are not using mind mapping? They may not be using the exact method that I just described, and they may not even be writing it down like I'm prescribing you to do on a piece of paper, but they have this strong mental capacity to draw the flow of the thoughts in the structure that I've just described in their own minds. Otherwise, I can guarantee you that no philosopher could come up with great philosophies or ideas. Without a way to manage your thinking, the creative process itself is stagnated. On the bright side, it is that if you are able to practice this mind mapping on a piece of paper for several years on a day-to-day basis, then after that it will be a part of your mental process and you will be able to do away with need to using pen and paper or even a mobile phone to annex your thoughts. At that point, people would say that you are a magician because you can think so deeply, extensively, vastly, widely, deeply, without getting any dark spots below the eyes, without any problems like burnt skin, stress, you name it. So I highly encourage you to practice this mind mapping technique. Hopefully, you can become the next Einstein and develop unimaginable theories about the universe or even about your own life that bring happiness to you and to the world. But it starts with you today.